Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Slipjoint 101. And today we're going to be talking about patterns. What is a pattern? What are the different patterns? Why do we call them patterns? And all that kind of good stuff so you can get a good understanding of it. And it has to do with collecting basically. Um, so if you look at this knife right here, pretty little knife. This pattern is called a regular jack, and the knife from the head of the knife, or from the tail of the knife down towards the head, it widens slightly, very slightly from down here, and we call that a regular jack. So if you open this knife up, you have the tang stamp there. It's a Robertson. If you turn it over, you have the model number. And in this case, the last three digits is the actual model number of the knife. It's a 639. So the first thing we have to realize is it's proper to call this knife by a pattern or a design even. You could say it's a knife design. Uh, the design is a regular jack. Pattern is an old number. We call it a pattern because when they first started making these jackknives, they literally used a pattern like a seamstress uses. And so that's why we call them patterns. It wouldn't be proper to call this by a model number because, in this case, if the manufacturer changed the configuration of the knife, so instead of jig bone, let's say he put in smooth bone, he might change the model number to 640. If he put mother of pearl, it might be 641. If he put a wood scale on here, it might be 642. He could change the configuration of the blade. This is a sheep's foot blade. Maybe he put a clip blade on it or some other type of blade, but he used the same pattern. And so you can see how the model number is not really descriptive of the knife. And that's why we use these pattern numbers so that we can, when we're talking to one another, when you want to buy a knife, when you want to sell a knife, or if you want to trade a knife, the guy you're talking to knows exactly what you're talking about. This knife right here is a serpentine two-bladed jack. You can see it has, anytime a knife has kind of an S pattern to it, it's called serpentine. And so this is a serpentine two-bladed jack. And if we were trading, I couldn't just tell you I have a two-bladed jack because these are two totally different knives. So you can see how it's helpful to understand the patterns and know what they mean. It just makes it a lot more efficient and easier to buy, sell, and trade knives. Back in the day, when they first started making these knives, they didn't have all these designations. Mostly, they just called them pocket knives or a hunting knife or a multi-blade or a sportsman knife if it was multi-blade. But in the 70s, the National Knife Collectors Association got together and designated all these knives to make it easier for us in the knife collecting hobby to buy, sell, and trade. So the first thing you need to understand is there's some large categories. So we recognize three large categories of knives. One is pen knives. Pen knives are small. They're usually pretty thin, and they have a, two or more blades set at opposite ends. So this knife has a blade at each end. They're usually 3/4 of an inch or less. And the way I know a knife's a pen knife is if you could put it in your top pocket and forget it's there, then it's a pen knife. That's the way that breaks down for me. The next category is like we've already looked like jackknives. Jackknives have 2 or more blades at one end. Sometimes they have a blade at the opposite end. And the reason this isn't considered a penknife when you have 2 or more blades and they're both set at opposite ends is this knife is too big to be considered a penknife. So this knife is almost 4 inches long and just too big to be considered a penknife. The last category is a multi-blade. Multi-blade knives are knives that have 3 or more blades on them, and there's really no size designation for them. So this knife has 4, and this is a utility knife pattern. And when they go up from that, they're usually just classified as a sportsman's knife. This knife has 9 blades, and yeah, it has 8 blades. And we just consider those sportsman's knife. So those are the 3 main categories, and that helps to kind of sort out the length and type of knife that you're talking about before you even get into the pattern. So sometimes these patterns can be really, really confusing, especially when you get into pen knives. Jackknives have way more patterns than pen knives. And so when you get into pen knives, sometimes pen knives borrow from the jackknife patterns. And here's a good example right here. This is a sportsman's knife design, but it's a little tiny pen knife. So that often happens with pen knives, not so much with the jackknives. But I'll give you one example. This is a cattle knife. So these were large, robust knives that were initially designed for ranchers, and farmers use these knives. And they're big, robust knives. It's on a 3.5 inch or 3 5/8 inch frame. So when you look at these 2 knives, they look a lot alike. And what's the difference between these 2 knives? And the truth is, utility knives are set on the same pattern as cattle knives. If you put these 2 together, you can't see a lot of difference in these knives. See that? And the difference is the purpose of the knife. So this knife has 1 more blade, but the purposes of this knife was as a utility knife for camping, outings, things like that. So people inside a city might use this knife quite often, and people on farms and ranches use this knife. So they're the same frame pattern, but they're different patterns because of the purpose of the knife. And we can extend that further to this knife. This knife is a canoe, and we call it a canoe because it kind of looks like a canoe. This knife is set on a cattle knife pattern. They're the same size. If you look at them like this, it'd be hard to distinguish between the 2 knives. Okay. So in this case, they cut the frame down a little bit so that you could easily open the blade, and they put the copperhead bolster on here so that it would hide the ends of the blades, and it would slip into the pocket easier. But again, the main difference between these knives, this has 3 blades and this has 3 blades. They're the same knife and on the same frame. The difference is this knife was designed as an EDC knife for framers, for people in the trades. And the truth is, these blades are much more robust than on a cattle knife. They're usually wider than the blades on a cattle knife. And so it's the purpose of the knife that distinguishes the difference in the pattern on the knives. And that's what you got to think about when you're looking at these patterns and you find one and you look at another one and you're like, hey, these are the same knives. what's the difference? And it can be pretty confusing. Some of these patterns will cross over into other categories of knives, and some of them won't. I'm just going to run you through a couple patterns real quick, just to show you some different ones. In America, like Ron Stewart and Roy Ritchie's book, The Standard Knife Collecting's Guide, listed 76. I think Levin's Guide to Knives and Their Values listed 79. I kind of feel there's almost 100 of these patterns as I look at them. I am a pattern collector. I've tried to collect all the different patterns, and so I see a little more variation than those authors did. But we're just going to go through a few of them. So this pattern is an equal end pattern. You notice both ends are equal. This pattern right here is a Texas toothpick, really popular pattern with people up to the 60s. Sometimes it's called a powder horn because the tip of it looks like the tip of a powder horn for black powder knives. This is, to me, this is kind of delicate. It's very thin, and you could use it for fishing or bird hunting, but it's really not a hunting knife, and most people didn't carry it as a hunting knife. Again, the regular jack pattern. This is a serpentine pattern because it looks kind of like an S. This pattern right here is a serpentine pattern, but it's a variation of a serpentine pattern, and we call it a dog leg because holding it like that, it looks like a dog's leg. See that? If you shrink this down into the penknife form, we call them peanuts. We don't call them dog legs. And that's because when it gets smaller, I guess it looks like a peanut. This pattern right here is commonly called a clasp pattern. It's a very old pattern where the knife kind of rolls up on the head end here. And these are folding hunters, that we call them. This is another regular jack pattern, but this is a large knife, so it would be considered a folding hunter. And some people might consider this a stabber. So in the mid to late 1800s, this was kind of the poor man's dirk, large blade. This knife is 5 inches. Blade's almost 5 inches, and it's a spear point blade. And so people use these for self-defense and call them stabbers. We would probably just consider that a folding hunter. This pattern here is called a lobster pattern. It's a very specific pattern knife, and the mainspring of the knife is inside the knife and not along the back. So the back spring is the heart of a slip joint knife. It's on the back, and that's why we call it a back spring. But the knife has to have a spring for the blades to work. In this case, it's on the inside. And these lobster patterns allowed the knife manufacturers to put blades on the top and the bottom of the knife and on both ends. So we just call those lobsters. This is technically a multi-blade, right? It has more than 3 blades. But we don't call it a multi-blade because we understand the pattern has 3 or more blades on it. Lobsters always had 3 or more blades. Let's see. All right. It's a long video, a lot of stuff to throw at you guys. I appreciate you for watching. If you like the video, I'd appreciate it if you like it. If you want to see more content like this, go ahead and subscribe. And remember, you shall know the truth shall set you free. And I really appreciate you guys watching the video. Thanks.